Hello everyone, this is Jimmy Cultist back again with another logic tutorial. Today we're discussing how to make a climbable ladder, which I've created a fairly good method to achieve such. First thing I've done, if you preview invisibility, I've created two blocks, stamped out two shapes from the sculpt mode. It's best to use grid snap. You can use mirror as well. But I've stamped them out. I've made them invisible and non-collidable. And on each I've put a microchip and I have grouped them with this ladder, which you can just tap X and then press group. If you want to scope into the group, it's L1 and X. If you want to scope out, it's L1 and circle. The ladder itself is actually still collidable, but it's not labeled anything in particular. Now, before I get into what I've attached to the puppet, I'm going to talk about what I put on the ladder. So let's make wires visible. In order to climb the ladder, you're going to need two states. One for getting on the ladder and one for getting off of the ladder. The first one, which is mounting the ladder, I have achieved by putting a trigger zone on the microchip. And it detects a tag called climb start, which we will get into later, like where that is on the puppet. If you want to resize the shape, you can use R2. If you want to change the center, you can just grab it with R2. And if you take the detected wire and attach it to a node, such as I have, then attach the output of this NOT gate to the power of the node, which you can easily access with L1 and square. Just tap X down there and you'll be able to attach the wire. Then attach the node to a timeline. This is a very familiar setup if you've seen our other videos. Set the timeline to play once. Put a switch on the timeline and attach it to the NOT gate to prevent playback. And you can change the duration of the playback by just using the D-pad to lengthen or shorten with the up and down arrow. Or you could take R2 and drag it like such. But what I've got on here is something very important, which is a tag called Player Tele L. This stands for Player Teleporter Ladder. So basically this is going to act as the position that our character enters the ladder. And I am going to go over to the character briefly and show you how that is done. In here I have a teleporter labeled to follow a tag and match orientation of a tag called Player Tele L, just as what's in here. It's on a timeline also, so it's active for a certain duration. And down below, because there's also a state for leaving the ladder, I've taken an action recorder, turned it to keyframe mode, and I've shut off this ladder by pressing L1 and square and just tapping the power. And the reason why I've shut it off is because I want it so that when you're climbing onto the ladder, the ability to get off the ladder is temporarily unusable. Like you can see here. Now I'm going to go into how you dismount the ladder real quick, and then we're going to go over the player. for this, I have a trigger zone set to detect a tag called leave ladder. It's at the very bottom of the ladder, and I'm going to have the tag on this character close to his feet so that when he approaches the ground, he'll get off the ladder. And because of the position we've chosen, the player will be slightly above this trigger zone, meaning he won't immediately get off the ladder as soon as he's on it. And we have this to also help, just in case. The logic is pretty much the same for leaving the ladder. Same timeline, same node. All that stuff is the same. The only slight difference is that we're shutting off the ability to mount the ladder instead of leave it. And the tag is closer to the ground. That's like the only difference. Now we've also got one up here, which is essentially exactly the same as this block down here. Like, you could literally just copy this, move it up here, which, by the way, if you want to clone something, just L1 and R2. You can pull it up like so, release R2. But the logic is pretty much the same. There is one minor thing that's different. You may notice that the start climb trigger zone is different from the start climb top trigger zone, and the positioning is different because it's at the top of the ladder rather than the bottom. But it's still relatively close to the ladder itself, so that there won't be too much accidental triggering of it. And of course, the position that the tag is putting you on is different, since it has to be, you know, has to be at the top of the ladder rather than the bottom. And the action recorder still shuts off the opposite trigger zone in both cases. Now for leaving the ladder, the position is pretty much the same as starting to climb the ladder, at least going back down. But now that I've demonstrated how to make the basic ladder logic itself, we need to get into how to make the player interact with this logic, which is pretty simple. First things first, scope into the player with L1 and X. Then press L1 and X again on this thing called puppet logic, which is always at the feet of the puppet. If you want to scope out again, it's L1 and circle. I've put down a little microchip labeled climb. Inside that, I put another microchip, which is not entirely necessary. I just did it as a precaution in case I need to move things to different areas of the logic. But I put it in another microchip called climbing. And in here, you will see our climb states. So to start with, we have the thing that triggers all of it, which is the start climb microchip. And there are two different types of climb start. Start from the top and start from the bot, which is short for bottom. I guess we can start with the bottom, since that's kind of where most people start out on a ladder. Now you're going to notice a similar configuration to how we prevented playback earlier, which is not gate in node, node attached to timeline, timeline set to play once. Only this time we've got a tag called climb start hooked up to the node, and when it comes in contact with a trigger zone, it will send an output. The trigger zone in question is this very trigger zone that I showed you earlier. So two things are going to be happening simultaneously. While this timeline is playing, this one will also be playing. And what is in our timeline? Very simple. We have a teleporter, which will only be active during this duration. a teleporter layer labeled Player Tele L. It's set to match target orientation. So basically, depending on how you've got this teleporter oriented, the Z and Y axis on it, which you can alter with R2, by the way, if you want to change it. And if you want to move it up and down, you can also grab the center with R2. But basically, this is going to affect the orientation of our character in reference to this tag, which is basically what our teleporter is chasing. So make sure you've got this orientation right, otherwise if you turn Z this direction, the player will be facing away from the ladder. I've also got this little follower. I don't know if it's highly necessary, but it kind of makes things slightly more smooth. It's set to detect a tag called Player Tele L, and it's set to speed 500, 100% strength, and 100% dampening. The radius and max distance is quite small, because if we have other ladders in the level, I figured I just didn't want to take chances, even though only this timeline, in the ladder, we'll be playing at any time. And if there are other ladders, this timeline, will be the only one you're attracted to. But I just thought I'd do it just in case. Next, I've got a little climbing animation, which, if you want to test these things, how he's going to mount the ladder, I advise copying this out, Player Tele L, just L1 and R2, and then stick it right down there. It will maintain the same orientation as how it is in the timeline. Then copy this out, and you'll be able to see where our player is going to be relative to the ladder. Now this comes in real handy if you need to animate things using an action recorder, which I have set to keyframe mode. Now I've got the initial idle position, which you'll notice is way down below where our player normally stands, which is indicated by this blue circle. I moved him down so that it, would actually be accurate to his position when he starts climbing the ladder. And I've created another frame where he's about to mount the ladder, which you can turn off invisibility, and you'll see how he's mounting it. It's not perfect, it doesn't align with the ladder 100%, but if you're someone with a lot of time, I had to do a demonstration quickly, so I don't have time to make this all look 100% good. But you can see the process. Now this final frame, which makes sure that you have selected all these parts with R2 that you're going to be messing around with, so that you can create a complete frame for all those body parts. And the reason why is because this final frame is actually going to end up being your idle frame for when you're sitting on the ladder and not moving. Now one other thing I'd like to talk about is this action recorder, which only has a single frame, still set to keyframe mode. And if you'd like to see what it does, we can turn on invisible connectors, and we'll see all the places that it connects to. First, it goes to int, which is a microchip containing the puppet interface and any other logic I might want to store in there. But mainly just turning off the puppet interface is what we're trying to accomplish. Next, it turns off this microchip called all, which contains all of our idle animations, poses, and jump animations. So by turning this off, we're turning that off as well. There's also this switch connected to a node, and that node, if you press L1 and square on the puppet when you're outside of its scoped in area, I don't know what this thing is called, but the blue circle, if you're outside of that and you press L1 and square, you'll get access to this menu. And I've connected the node with X to procedural animations and procedural walk. And the reason why I like to turn these off when doing things like animations is the feet will be all glitchy and trying to interact with the floor if you don't turn this off. So basically I've put this all on one chip so that I can save myself invisible wires and just close these two pieces of logic with a couple wires. Now there are some other things that I've turned off. The first is this node. And you may have noticed our selector here. If you stamp it out and connect B to the node, and then connect the node to this, which is the climbing state. If you're mounting the ladder, you don't want the ability to move up and down the ladder, otherwise you'll be, floating while mounting it. So you'd have to turn off this node in order to prevent you from doing any further, messing around with it. It basically contains all the logic inside. Now it seems like there might be something inside here that I've turned off. I think though that's just a artifact of me in the testing phase, because you really don't have to turn off anything in here. Just turn off the node and then it'll turn off the rest. And that's pretty much everything that this little action recorder does. This is the switch which prevents playback, of course. Now this is actually a trigger switch, and I might make it blue so it's easier to distinguish. And what it does is it connects to the B output on this selector. And before we get into what the selector does, I'd like to cover something real quick. You'll notice that from A output on the selector, we have a wire running to the power of our microchip called Start Climb. Now the reason why I did this is so that as soon as you have triggered B and have started, your climb state, you will be unable to trigger these because they're connected to A and A is no longer active. And I've done it the same with ending the climb state. I've connected B to it so that it will only be possible to leave climb state when you're in it, not before. And we'll get into that too a little bit later. But basically on both of these chips, we've got this little trigger switch, which I'm going to make blue so that it's easy to discern which is which. And it's going into B and turning on the climb state. I might get into the climb state real quick since it is kind of important. And we'll open it up in here. I've mounted a little camera in here, set to smooth, 0.5 transition time. Nothing else has been altered. And it just gives you a little view. It's to make it easier when you're climbing the ladder. You won't get your camera all glitched up. It's basically all it serves. It also does serve the function of when you're mounting the ladder and climbing down, there's this weird glitch where your camera gets stuck at the top of the ladder, but using this, that won't happen. And the most important set of logic is this thing here, a microchip called controls. And I'll explain exactly what's going on with it in a little bit. By the way, we don't need this. That was from the testing phase. But the first thing you're going to want inside this microchip called controls is a node connected to a splitter. And take the output B from the splitter and connect it to this splitter. And I'll explain why we have done this real quick. I'm going to power on the microchip. You can't really see this stuff very well when it's powered off, but this is actually the up-down output of the splitter, which we've connected to another splitter, which will allow us to manipulate the positive and negative output, which is basically up and down on the control stick. And the control stick in question we can access from the controller sensor with L1 and square. We're using left stick local, which you can grab with X, and connect to this node, which will basically start the system rolling. So up and down on the left stick will allow us to climb up and down. And I'll explain how we do our climbing. In both of these microchips is logic for climbing up and climbing down. They're basically the same, the only difference is what direction they control. So first we have climbing up on the node, which is, it's connected, I should say. Minus goes up and plus goes down. The timeline is set to play once. And we've actually got a switch in here to prevent playback, but you may notice there's no, NOT gate like there usually is. That's because I wanted to consolidate logic and save on wires by connecting the NOT gate to the controls microchip's power instead of these individual nodes. So basically both these timelines have a playback prevention switch which is connected to the NOT gate. And the NOT gate is connected to a single source of input, which is the controls microchip. So I just thought I'd explain that real quick. There's also this action recorder, which shuts off your idle animations chip. And basically all the idle animations chip contains is an action recorder set to loop, called idle, of course. And it's just that final frame of when you mount the ladder that I was talking about earlier, looped over and over again, so that when you're not moving, that's the state you're in. And that's all it does. It just shuts that off while you're moving, which is this duration. Now, getting the timing right on this depends on how fast you want him to climb the ladder. I've also left the speed just to 100%, nothing higher, because it might be too fast otherwise. I've also created a climb animation, which you can just duplicate the idle, like so. What you could do is take the idle, open it up with L1 and X, then L1 and X again, where you can see all the frames you've recorded. Select them all by dragging with X and selecting, and then you can duplicate them by holding L1 and R2 and press the left arrow on the D-pad to make 4 copies, which are going to act as your climbing animation. Now they're all going to be blank and the same, of course, to start out with, but you can actually record each frame, and the result is an animation like this, which is very fast and kind of not that great, but I had to make it for demonstration purposes. I'm sure people who are a lot more, interested in fine-tuning it could get a much better climbing animation, but I'm just giving you the basics of how to create one. So that's the animation done with. Next, we've got the thing that makes you go up the ladder, which is a mover. It is not set to local space. This is important. It will always take you up, no matter what your orientation is. The forward speed is set to 2.0, maximum strength and maximum dampening. So while you're climbing, you're going to be moving up at that speed, which is fairly slow. And you may notice this little tiny mover at the very end here. And basically what this is going to do is when you reach the end of your climbing animation, it's going to stop your velocity immediately because it's set to 0 forward speed. This will keep you from continually floating off into the air after you've finished a climb animation, because that will happen if you don't put this at the end. It's essentially the same as this mover, the only difference is it's set to 0 speed. I've also got this tag called Leave Ladder. Now what Leave Ladder does is whenever you're climbing up, it will constantly be active. So that means if you look up here, you'll see the leave ladder thing, or trigger zone, I should say, up here, which I mentioned earlier. So when you're climbing up, you're going to interact with this thing, and you're going to trigger this. But something else you're going to trigger is, when the trigger zone hits this tag, it's going to send an output. And that output goes into this microchip called top end, which means, you know, climbing up the top of the ladder, basically. Which is right in here. Top end. So I just thought I'd mention that real quick. And the other one is basically exactly the same. The only difference is the mover is pointing down. That's the only difference. And the leave ladder tag is below him rather than at the top. The position, that is. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but the position of this tag is higher than the position of the other one. Because you'll notice that our trigger zone is closer to the ground, meaning we'd want to trigger it first. But they're only active depending on which direction you're moving, so you're not going to accidentally trigger both. If you're going down, you're triggering this one. If you're going up, you're triggering that one. And because they're in different positions, it's also extremely unlikely that you'll trigger both, which will prevent a lot of glitches. Anyway, I think it's about time we get into some of the other nitty-gritty. Real quick though, I'm going to check and make sure I've got everything. Yep, I think we've covered everything in here. Now for the final section, which is ending the climb. The most important part, because what good is climbing a ladder if you can't leave one? I'm going to delete this real quick because it's not necessary. In here, similar to this one, they're basically the same thing. The only difference is their purpose is slightly different, but they have the same logic, which is, you know, a trigger zone and a NOT gate connected to a timeline. I don't actually think we need this trigger zone. It's probably left over from our testing phase. Yeah, I don't think we need it, because we no longer measure things that way, so just forget about that. Neither of those are necessary. So, we have top end and top bottom. Now, one thing that is going to be slightly more complicated about ending the climb versus starting it is the animation involved is a little bit more complex. But as soon as we have triggered the ending, I've got this little handy switch running into A, which will reset our selector. I've also got this action recorder, which turns off our climb state, allowing us to leave it freely, even though this is, you know, currently inactive. Just turn off that node there. I might check and... oh yeah, it also turns off this and this. Similar to how you mount the ladder, basically just copy them, L1 and R2, from the start climb timelines. I've also got a more complex animation which allows him to leave the ladder. It's not very good, but it gets the idea across. You can extend the duration at your leisure and make more frames and make it more, you know, good looking. But we've got a teleporter on here, which will be active when we reach the top, and we have triggered leave ladder. Here is the position of the tag, and getting the right position will require a bit of, you know, experimentation. But you can test it by just, you know, climbing to the top of the ladder and then pausing if you know how to pause with R3, or I should say, you know, tapping the right stick, pressing it in and out allows you to pause, so you can pause while you're climbing to test this stuff. But let's talk about what it does. I might just get on the ladder again, it's easier to orient myself. Oh, also we can delete this now that we're no longer testing, because it's not highly necessary. I only copied that out so that I could test how these things are working. I think I left it somewhere in there. You can see our mount is going pretty good, getting on the ladder. But anyway, back into this business. Won't need that. It's going to require that to get off the ladder, you know, because you're on a teleporter, how are you going to get him up here without it looking, you know, really abrupt, because teleporters move extremely fast. So how are you going to get him to climb the ladder? Well, you could use a mover, but I think that would be a little janky too. Or I should say you could use a follower, similar to what we use to mount the ladder. A follower set to detect a tag, which you could just stick on the timeline, which could be like, I don't know, anything. But you could just put it up at the top and have it say, go here, or something. But I think that'd be janky, so what I've done, actually, is I've created a keyframe, which you can find in here. I've set them to linear blend. The first one is blank, and the second one actually moves the position of your teleporter down, so that it's sort of like causing you to move upwards, because your teleporter will stay oriented the same, but if you move the position, it's like you're floating upwards. There I am, moving it down further. You also will want to move it to the back for the final frame, so that you actually clear the ladder itself and end up on the roof or whatever platform you're trying to climb. But by doing this, and then just cutting off the duration of the teleporter, we'll essentially position ourselves at the top of the ladder and get out of its zone of control. The animation can be kind of difficult to have match up with the teleporter, but with trial and error you'll get something pretty good. I've also put a little mover set to 1.0 and local space, oriented to push the player forward just in case things don't go entirely right, which they should go entirely right. Now for dismounting, things are slightly different. The reason why is because getting off the ladder, there's usually always ground underneath the ladder, and it's not so difficult to just disconnect and land on the ground as it is to climb up and over something. So the logic for this part, dismounting the ladder, is actually really easy. It's just an action recorder that turns off the climbing state and triggers the selector. It's very simple. Now, one thing I would mention, though, about the ladder itself is these timelines are going to be triggered at the same time that you're mounting the ladder, which I mentioned earlier. And they shut off the ability to, you know, start climbing the ladder again. So when you're leaving, these keyframes will be the exact duration before you have the ability to climb again, you know, and get back on the ladder. And how long you want them to be largely depends on you, but I would keep in mind that the length of your animations, or lack thereof, is basically what you want to keep in mind when deciding how long this should stay active. Which again is trial and error. But let's go ahead and see how our climb works. There is a little abruptness with the camera. Possibly something you could do to help with that abruptness is if you put a camera on here, well, just a sec, put it on your climb start timeline, and if you put it on here and have it last the duration of your climb start animation, it'll make the camera move into place a little bit more, you know, less abruptly. And if we move down, it'll be off. Although there's something weird going on here. I think... I'm not... Ah, this is it. I left that for the testing purpose, but it's going to mess things up, so let's go ahead and get rid of that. Works pretty good. Now, of course, you might want to prevent your ability to move for a long time. Or your leave ladder duration could be shorter. Make it like about that short should do. And that'll make it so you can get off quicker. Probably want it even shorter than that. There we go. Fixed. We're having a little issues with the top. Oh, this is why. I thought I was messing with the bottom. I've been messing with the top this whole time. You want the duration to be long at the top, because it's going to take a long time to get out of it. Here is where you want it to be short. Let's go ahead and try it out, though, just to make sure it works. Maybe not too short. Another thing you could do is extend the amount of time before you can move. Because when you start from the bottom, you could just make this thing slightly longer so that you won't be moving too fast. Oops. Oh, I know what it is. I'm shutting off everything, so it's causing, yeah. Here's what you need to do. Turn off the NOT gate with a timeline and just put it close to the end here. Just to prevent your movement a little bit. Another thing you might do is you could pull this all the way down just to make sure that it gets triggered. There we go. Now let's go to the top. It should work right now. And there you have it. Then you can get back on the ladder by just walking close to it. Another neat thing is once you have this all in a group inside the ladder, you can just duplicate the ladder and move it to anywhere you want. I've actually created a duplicate of this one already. Animation could use some work. But there you go. That's how you make a ladder. I'm sure some people might have other methods of making a ladder, but this is what I came up with as best I could. It's a fairly simple method. Now the only downside I can think of to this method is You do have to properly time everything, which can be a little bit monotonous to work with. And another downside is the reliance on trigger zones. If your game has lots of zones active, that's going to run up the thermo a bit. But I'd say it's relatively simple. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this was an insightful video or otherwise enjoyable. If it was, then go ahead and subscribe if you can, and hit the bell to keep up with our videos. Also, subscribed or not, give a like. If you have any questions or statements, leave a comment. We try to answer all comments. If you like what we do here and want to help out, consider becoming a channel member. Alternatively, you can check out the link in the description to support us through Patreon. Until next time, take it easy. That's all for now.